Dr. Richard Urso is based in Houston, Texas, and we're going to talk with him about two issues, probably more than two, but two at least I definitely want to talk with him about. One is all the headlines we keep seeing in the media about the number of new cases of COVID and how fearful we should be about that. And number two is the most unbelievable publication by, I would use the right word, a guidance published by the National Institute of Health regarding the use of therapeutics, meaning medications for COVID-19. So without further ado, I believe we have Dr. Richard Urso online. And there he is.
Hey, Debbie, how are you? I got to make a comment about something, the political overreaction that you talked about. Early on, the draconian measures never made sense from the very earliest time. It never should have happened this way. The medical response was an underreaction, and the political response was an overreaction. There's never a reason we should have locked down. John Ioannidis from Stanford knew right away. Some of us in medicine knew right away that there was treatment for this disease early on. It's very easy if you break this down in its component parts. There's an infection, there's inflammation, there's breathing problems, and there's blood clots. It's very easy to treat blood clots as an outpatient, aspirin. It's very easy to treat breathing problems. We have all kinds of things we use for asthma. Guess what? They work for COVID, budesonide and other inhalers. Inflammation, there's steroids, hydroxychloroquine, many drugs. And on the infection side, it was quite clear there was a lot of candidate drugs. Protease inhibitors, hydroxychloroquine, chloroquine, doxycycline, azithromycin. There was others. Fenofibrate came to mind for me. There's colchicine. There's a few things that I thought might work early on, but hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine jumped to the forefront. And it seemed to me to be silly that we weren't treating early on. We were telling doctors to go home. The political overreaction of lockdowns, masks, social distancing, wait for a vaccine, that never made sense either for a variety of reasons. It's an unsustainable model. You can't sustain society with that kind of a model. As it turned out, the disease was quite clear early on, and Ioannidis figured it out, I think in February. I was talking to people overseas, and it was quite clear to me that it was only old people that were dying for the most part in big, big numbers. The rest of the population, it was quite clear, in March I'm talking about, that everyone else had comorbidities. It was quite clear they had diabetes, kidney disease, other things. So all the things we now know are true were true in March. So it was an overreaction from the beginning. Anybody who says different is lying.
Well, that was great. I was going to say that. Well, you covered a lot of my questions, but I'm still going to dive in anyway. Because I was going to say, early on, there were really bad prognostications made in England. There was one alleged expert related who makes models about infectious diseases and how it's going to impact and what numbers of people might die and what numbers of people are going to need ICU beds. Massive estimations made out of both this outfit in England as well as in America, two sources in America. And very early on, we figured out, and they actually retracted their numbers and said, actually, it's not nearly as bad as we thought. But somehow, that very first fearful kickoff is like, that's what stayed as the standard assumption and the assumption of facts on the ground that caused us to move forward and make the policies that we did. It's like we never adjusted the reality of our treatments to the numbers. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you made a good point. I mean, Neil Ferguson, he's made a career out of overestimating pandemics. He's done this over and over again. I've always been interested in public policy. I have a political science degree originally. So I've always followed this stuff. He's made a career out of this. He's never been accurate. I can tell you, go back through his record. If you go back through it all the way back to the early 2000s, he's overestimated by logarithmic units of every single pandemic that's ever occurred. So when he said it, I didn't even pay attention to it. I listened to Ioannidis. He's a genius. Stats guy out of Stanford, and he called it right away. I think it was early March, and said, we're not going to have their numbers are the measures are draconian, and he's been right ever since. And basically knowing that there was treatment right away, I knew, knowing there was treatment, that it should never have gone on this long. And like I said, I think that's probably the thing I'd say about the early measures. You had the estimates made by this guy, and our people here in our United States just followed his model. And the guy's never made an estimate that was not overestimated. He made a career out of it.
It's an amazing thing. So let's just actually talk about the NIH thing first. So you mentioned, I couldn't write down everything you said, but you mentioned various treatments. We've had on this show Dr. Richard Bartlett from Midland, who talked about inhaled budesonides for people struggling breathing. These are treatments for asthma, and it's a steroid, and he found it to be highly efficacious in helping relieve people's breathing struggles. And then hydroxychloroquine, we had other, remdesivir, I can't even pronounce all of them, other treatments, other therapies that doctors are using and finding successful. And we've had them on, not only mentioned Dr. Bartlett, we had Dr. Simone Gold, we've had, and now you're joining us. So I want to ask you, so in this, for our listeners who don't know this, you can, by the way, my friends, my listeners, you can read this on our website. Go to americacanwetalk.org. On the homepage shows, drop down list of links. This article is in there. There's a National Institute of Health, NIH, guidance on therapeutics for COVID-19 patients, updated October 9th. And it says essentially, it recommends against any form of treatment for patients with mild to moderate COVID-19 symptoms who do not require supplemental oxygen, which is the ventilator. So they're basically saying they recommend doctors prescribe nothing to COVID-19 patients unless they're sick enough to need to be on oxygen. So, Dr. Urso, does that make any sense to you?
Should I laugh? I mean, that's this is insane. We never do this. This is be the only disease in history that we decided not to treat patients. As I said earlier, it's a very simple disease. There's breathing issues. My very first patient in March, middle of March, before Trump ever said anything, I looked at the data set and I said, hydroxychloroquine makes a lot of sense. Azithromycin. I got on a feed with somebody from France. They were doing it there, I gave it to 3 people, a family, and it worked quite well for the wife, for the son, but the husband was actually quite had difficulty breathing, and so I made a call. Like, I remember he was about day 7 into it, and I said, viral loads usually drop off after day 7. So he probably doesn't have a high viral load. He probably has more of an inflammatory response. So I decided to use budesonide, and within a couple hours, his breathing issues significantly improved. And we used the nebulizer. I've used the inhaler over the counter also. But it's an amazing combination of things. It works quite well. And the only thing I'd say in somebody who has this now is we add in aspirin, because we know blood clots are a big deal. And I think that pretty much helps most people. That would be a very, very good regimen for 99% of people who are ill, especially if you had comorbidities. I mean, it makes no sense to wait until you get ill. It's just, you're letting the disease progress. So I don't know if you know this, Debbie, but there's something called disease tolerance. So it's not just about controlling the pathogen. It's also about mitigating the damage to yourself. So you want to, in a sense, kids don't get as affected because they don't have as many ACE2 receptors, and so disease mitigation occurs because of decreased ACE2 receptors. But for most of us, one of the things we could do if we tend to be in a category where we're overreacting, the cytokine storm, you can mitigate some of that stuff with steroids, with other things like hydroxychloroquine. It's a great anti-inflammatory. So you mitigate the damage, and you do that early. You don't wait until damage. It's like a cascade of events, knocking over dominoes. It's really, I consider it almost criminal, against the Hippocratic Oath. What I usually say is, we need sense, not nonsense, science, not science fiction, and doctors, we need the Hippocratic Oath, not hypocrisy. It's hypocrisy for a doctor to actually go and not treat a patient. It's literally everything that we shouldn't be for.
I was going to ask you on this subject. It's such I will tell you, Dr. Simone Gold, whom I know, Dr. Urso, you know also, she was in the show last week, and she was here whatever day that was, Wednesday, and later in the evening called to say, because this announcement I'm talking about, this NIH announcement had just come out, or she just become aware of it, and she said you almost took your breath away thinking, what are they saying here? So let me ask, leaving aside the specifics of this, the therapies which you're aware of, do you know of other diseases that doctors in this country are told by the NIH don't give any patient any therapies until they're extremely ill? Has this ever happened, any other disease, to your knowledge?
Debbie, this has never happened. It's never happened. It's never even been suggested to happen. Obviously, you want to do no harm. If we don't have a remedy for something, we don't do anything. We obviously have remedies for breathing, for inflammation, for infection, for blood clots. It makes no sense. It's never happened before. And I just want to add one thing. We have an illustrious group of people who have worked on this. You have some of the top people from, Harvard, Stanford, Yale. This is not something where you don't have a strong group of people that have been working on this. We now have an outpatient protocol that is very well detailed on how to treat patients as an outpatient. It'll sort of be a blueprint for everyone who wants to use it. All the docs who want some kind of protocol. It's going to be published. It's actually right there in Dallas. Peter McCullough is kind of heading this up for us. He came out with the American Frontline Doctors and presented this information for us on our second summit. And it's a very well-detailed protocol that anybody in the world can use to treat patients early and successfully and safely.
Okay, you mentioned America's Frontline Doctors. I want to mention that to our listeners. At the close of our interview with Dr. Gold last week, she mentioned if you want any information, America's, and you have to listen very carefully to get it correct, to get the name of the website correct, because there's already competing websites trying to pull you away and sell the leftist mission, the leftist storyline. But America's, AMERICAS, frontlinedoctors.com. So she and others you're describing, Dr. McCullough and others, put this together, and you can get all this information you need about children, elderly people, all sorts of, they have little videos, and the struggle they have had to even keep that website up, because what they have is a particular doctor or topic, and you should be able to click on it, and it takes you to a video, and they explain in very simple terms whatever the issue is. They run through like any person could follow, and they've had repeated instances of, I know Vimeo was one of them, but various platforms simply taking the videos down. So the website's up, but you can't see the videos. I believe it's back up today. But this is another thing I want to get into, Dr. Urso, and ask you. Social media is interfering in ways I have never seen before, interfering with doctors speaking the truths you're saying, you're trying to tell people, taking down the videos for America's frontlinedoctors.com. And these people pulling down videos who work for Vimeo or YouTube or Facebook are not doctors. Do you have any idea what is the reason do you have a speculation why these videos, it's so hard to keep correct information about COVID up online?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts on that. For one, the term they usually use doesn't agree with World Health Organization standards or something like that. I didn't know they were the purveyors of all scientific truth. In general, I do have some other thoughts for you that I'll give to you in a second, but I think censorship cannot be tolerated because it's, in order for science to go forward, it's necessary for the security of scientific thought for us to have a competing and differing opinions sometimes. It fosters public discussion. I think a lot of times it allows us to pressure the government and other agencies into doing the right thing. So you really have to stop censorship. It doesn't make any sense to do that. These are things that just shouldn't be happening. Now, why is it happening? There is an incredible amount of money in vaccines and antivirals. They stopped, for instance, in France, they pulled hydroxychloroquine off the counter in October of last year, calling it a class 2 poison. Well, it's probably the safest drug in history. And all I can say is, all I can pin to is that hydroxychloroquine is the linchpin, and that's why they've attacked it so much. And I'm gonna give you a little thought on it. Is that basically it affects viruses by something called endosomal acidification. It's basically like there's a little trash bag that the viruses have to go into once they get into a cell. So hydroxychloroquine will block the virus from getting in the cell a little bit, but eventually the virus is going to get in. And what it does is it prevents and stunts the growth of viral particles. So viruses can't really make good particles. So what ends up happening is a person who's on hydroxychloroquine is going to make attenuated, stunted particles. They'll get immunity. They may get mildly sick or not sick at all. And basically it's kind of vaccine-like. In a sense, and if people are PCR positive, they always look for PCR positive because hydroxychloroquine is always going to allow some viral particles to be made. So if I was going to design a trial to show that it doesn't work, I would always check for PCR rather than illness or hospitalization. But at the end of the day, what I've been telling everybody is the reason it's being attacked so much, it kills an industry better than it kills the virus. It eliminates the need for vaccines.
Wow.
It eliminates the needs for antivirals and vaccines for the most part. It cuts the whole industry, Tamiflu, COVID vaccine, flu vaccine. It works on all these RNA airborne viruses. And I think that's what the major attack has been on that particular drug.
That is, I like that line too. It kills the industry worse than it kills, even more than it kills the virus. Okay, so this is our NIH, and this is our federal government. First of all, your taxpayer dollars go to Washington to fund NIH, to fund the research they do, the salaries of people who work there, everything, all the expenses involved with NIH are funded by taxpayers. And so there is, coming out of NIH, literal advice, guidance they call it, that's telling doctors not to prescribe things. In fact, the exact language I have, no specific antiviral or I can't even say the word, immunomodulatory therapy is recommended for COVID-19 patients who are not hospitalized. So if you're not hospitalized, they're saying don't give them any medication, or who are hospitalized without requiring oxygen. So basically, unless they need oxygen, don't give them any medications at all. I mean, actually, isn't that advice, if it's closely followed, Doctor, wouldn't that actually result in the death of some people who might otherwise be saved by the therapies that we're talking about, like hydroxychloroquine?
I want to answer that question in two parts. First of all, I want to help you with the fact that the biggest funders for the NIH, CDC, and the FDA and Fauci's group are the drug companies. And nobody has to draw them a map to know that when they get done there, they have good jobs waiting for them on sitting on board the drug companies. So if you want to know why this is happening, you don't have to be a genius to figure out, follow the money trail. That's the first thing. So it's not all taxpayer funded. Fauci has, I think, 4 patents on remdesivir himself. So, and that's fine. I mean, I don't mind that. I mean, let people be creative and figure out things, and that's great. But at the end of the day, it's polluting the policy. And unfortunately, now what we're seeing is we're seeing policy coming out of there, which literally, as we talked about, doesn't make any sense from a medical standpoint. We have treatments that are quite successful. As you said, will lots of patients die? Well, let me say this. Lots of patients have already died because of the policies, and this was not necessary. It was quite clear in March that these things could mitigate the disease and actually save a lot of lives. So are more people going to die by this new policy of the NIH? Absolutely. Is it going to be tens of thousands? Well, let me say this to you. I looked at the data on this over pandemics over the last 100 and so years. And so what we see is, we saw a big peak in March and followed by a small peak about 110 days later. And in all the big pandemics, that's what you see. A large peak early on when there's lots of susceptibles, and then a small peak as it makes its way through the population and goes into other areas. And you see it about 110 days later. In all the big pandemics, that's what you see over and over. And we're on the back end of the small peak. So the pandemic's over. We now have what I would call a case-demic. Lots of cases. For instance, 70,000 college kids had cases, 3 hospitalizations, 0 deaths. Okay, so lots of cases. But the pandemic is now a case-demic, and this is kind of a tongue twister, but the disease is endemic in the population. So we're going to see small pockets of disease. We're going to have maybe a local area in some communities, maybe in Missouri or wherever, where they're going to see a lot of cases. But when you look at the totality of the United States of America, you're not going to get pandemic type levels. It's not going to happen.
Okay, so that actually segues well into my other big topic I want to hit with you. And in my first 5, I was talking about this. I see the whole American policy response to COVID-19, to the coronavirus, as something the left pounced on as an opportunity to expand power, expand tyranny, change the American populist perception of what the basic promise of freedom, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness means, to where we are surrendering our liberty and allowing more and more government tyranny out of fear. And so we have a pandemic of fear in this country, worse than a pandemic at this point of COVID-19. But what I want to ask you is, there are all these different headlines. I mean, you see them every day in newspapers around the country. Here's just one I happen to pick out. At a breaking point, new surge of COVID-19 cases has states, hospitals scrambling yet again. So people see the headline, new cases, and they point to that and say, this proves that the policies we've embraced were not being stringently enforced enough. This proves that we have not done a good enough job handling this disease because we have new cases. And so there are a lot of answers to that, but do these headlines about new cases, Dr. Urso, do they prove that somehow our policy in this country was not effective in dealing with the virus?
I think the best way to do is look at the data. And when we look at the totality of the United States, we see a large peak in March and a small peak in July. We're at the bottom end of the small peak. I've actually got a graph here. I don't know if you could show it on the camera, but I'll try, because we're at the bottom end of the peak nationally. You're going to have pockets of disease. That's why I say it's endemic. But in fact, I won't show it. I can send it to you, and I'll let you show it to your audience another day. But I think it's basically, we have peak when we in March, large peak, and now we've got a smaller peak, and we're on the back end of this smaller peak. That's just the data. That's not anybody. That's the CDC's data. So you can scream about it all you want, but this is just the CDC's data that we're at the bottom end of the second peak, a much smaller peak, and it is what it is. The data it shows in the totality of the country where the death rate is extremely low.
That's what I get at. So cases doesn't mean death rate. Cases doesn't mean hospitalization. Cases doesn't necessarily mean at all a stretch on or a potential threat of a shortage of ICU beds. Cases just means people testing positive, right?
I've got some funny stuff to tell you about that. You want to hear it?
Absolutely.
Okay. So cases, when you say somebody's got cancer, right, you'd expect to see a mass of some sort, right? So if somebody has a case, they'd be sick, right? So what we've done, though, is we've taken this test called PCR, and we've attributed that a positive test is PCR, it means you're sick, all right? So I'm going to quickly go over this for you. PCR means that you found a particle of something that matched the virus. Well, let me give you an example. When you do the cycles on this, you go each time you double the rate. So by the time you get to 20 cycles, you've got 1 million pieces of material. When you get to 30, you've got 1 billion. When you get to 40, you've got 1 trillion. So we're looking at these small, tiny little particles, which are non-infectious, and they're letting these cycle rates run up to 40. So most of these people that are cases are not sick, number one. Like I told you, 70,000 kids, 3 hospitalizations in college. So those cases are just particles of virus that, if anything, they're so small they're not causing disease. And if they are particles of the actual virus rather than a piece of chromosome made in our own body that matches it, if they are particles of that, they're actually spreading immunity, not spreading disease. Okay, if those people running around as cases with no symptoms are spreading around small particles which are non-infectious and are actually spreading immunity. Lastly, I got to tell you a funny story. The president of Tanzania didn't believe this stuff because he was seeing so many people positive who weren't sick. So he took a swab and he swabbed a goat, a quail, and a pawpaw, which is a fruit. And all 3 came back positive. He said, I've had it.
Gosh.
Take these back. And I joke about it because, none of the pawpaw wasn't sick. Pawpaw was healthy, so, but bottom line is, like, we're looking at something and driving fear with a test that has 90% false positives because they've allowed the doubling to get up to 1 trillion pieces. And when you hold it at 24, you're getting real deal. You're getting particles that are big enough to be whole viruses. Anything over 24 is very rare to be able to grow viral particles. But I think it's okay. Like if you said to me, what do you recommend? I'd say if you go up to a rate of 30, you're going to catch a few false positives, but that's okay. We don't want to let stuff slip through. But when you let it go up to 40, you're basically creating fear. You're creating a pandemic of fear. All those people at those levels are non-infectious particles, if they are even there, true particles, and those are spreading immunity, not disease.
Okay, so I want to confirm the last few little bits of data. We talked about this before in the show, but the CDC has frequently put out data relating to death rates. And one point was, essentially, for most Americans, if you don't have comorbidity and you're not over whatever it is, 70 or 80, you pretty much have a 99% survival rate, even if you get COVID. Is that right?
99.997.
Yeah, so almost everyone, unless you have comorbidities, okay, survives. And then the second one, this point about all these cases, the reason I wanted to hone in on it was, and thank you for that detailed explanation and that story, but people who say the headlines that say cases are going up does not mean we have an increased number of sick people headed to their deathbed. It just means people who tested positive, correct?
Correct. So in a couple of countries, like in the Netherlands, they actually have more cases now with 10 times less deaths. 10 times less deaths. So they have more positive cases. Again, I wish I could show the graphs for you. That'd be beautiful, because it's just a picture's worth 1,000 words. And basically, you're getting lots of cases and very, very few deaths, because those cases, those aren't really cases. You got to remember, those aren't cases. Those are PCR positive. None of those people are sick. I mean, 90% of them aren't sick.
Yeah. Okay. Well, next time we do this, I will I love charts. I'm big into visuals, charts, graphs. I had one, but I forgot to send it to Derek, so I can't put it up either. But it was a chart, I think, from the CDC, but it was basically about daily COVID. It was about occupancy, available beds, COVID tests, basically saying we don't have a crisis in this country, a shortage of hospital beds, short of ICU beds, and we are at the tail end, as you were saying, of this coronavirus. I hate to even use the word pandemic, coronavirus infection of America. So, Dr. Urso, first of all, I don't know, I know I mentioned the America's frontlinedoctors.com. Is there anyone else people can go, anywhere else they can go to hear more from you about this, about COVID and the way we're handling it in America?
Well, I've worked with American Frontline Doctors. That's the site we use. But I post a lot of material on Twitter. @RichardUrsoMD is my hashtag, @RichardUrsoMD, and I put a lot of this information out there, and I'm happy to share. Please reach out. We can do this together. It's we the people, as you said, and it's this pandemic, the social Marxism and the cultural Marxism that we're going through right now. And these guys are using fear to try to drive this pandemic, and I'm just really disappointed in that. And at the end of the day, we just got to stick to the science. The data is there. Pandemic is as I said, is a case-demic, but clearly there are endemic features, which means there's small amounts of cases going on in the country, no question, but not at pandemic levels, 10 times lower than what they were.
Dr. Richard Urso, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join me. I appreciate you joining me.
Thank you.